Love Tribe, welcome to Bitcoin for Peace. Guess who I have here with me? I have someone who's a myth buster and a warrior for a safer, healthier, clean planet. This is Elliot David of the Sustainable Bitcoin Protocol. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you for having me. Really, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for being so accommodating to my schedule and having to reschedule this. I think this is our third reschedule, so thank you so much for being so flexible,
Yeah,
Elliot.
Bitcoin keeps you
Um,
busy, so I'm happy that we managed to find a time.
Me too. Well, so let's talk to the audience. Like, let's let everybody know who you are. What's the Sustainable Bitcoin Protocol, and how'd you get here?
Sure. So, um, SBP essentially what we've set out to do is, promote transparency and sustainability in the Bitcoin network. Also, alleviate some of the concerns that investors might have. Basically, promote Bitcoin adoption by creating this like transparency layer for the network. And in addition to that, we recognized a challenge where Bitcoin miners that wanted to use sustainable energy sources, but didn't necessarily have a way to price that into their operations. Um, so that's what we've solved for. We've created a way essentially to price in the environmental benefit of sustainable Bitcoin mining. So both transparency and actually using market-based solutions to drive the sustainability of the Bitcoin network.
And how did you
And
get
then I guess,
involved with?
mhm,
Yeah, how did you get involved in
yeah,
Bitcoin? And
and
you've obviously got a huge background in the environment. Why don't you let everybody know how you got? How did you blend these two worlds?
sure. So, it's funny. I find that especially as Bitcoin mining has become has grown to industrial scale, you see a lot of Bitcoiners that come into the energy space.
Hmm.
Um, or maybe they're starting to pull in people from the energy space. I was somebody who was working in energy and climate for a while, and then sort of before I even understood the important philosophical and monetary freedom, financial inclusion implications of Bitcoin,
Hmm.
really just from a power and energy perspective, kind of came into the space. Um, so my background, I've spent the last decade or so working across the nonprofit, public sectors in climate and energy. Um, and I would say, in particular, I started to get really interested in energy poverty um, in around 2017 or 2016, 2017, after Hurricane
Hmm.
Maria and Irma hit Puerto Rico. Um,
Mm.
and for the listeners that aren't familiar, Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. Had about 3 million people living there at the time, which, as far as states go, it would have been, I think, like the 16th or 17th most populous state.
Hmm.
And in 2016, there was a hurricane that devastated the island's power system. So basically the entire island's inhabitants were without electricity for several months, and thousands of people, as a consequence, perished. Not just because of the sort of ferocity of the hurricane, but actually because they didn't have access to electricity, which was necessary for water filtration, for medical
Hmm.
services, for medicine. Um, and so at that point, I think that was when it kind of struck me that electricity is really the lifeblood of humanity. It's
Yeah.
the most core. Um, Energy access is what unlocks all these other really important systems like water and transportation and food security and safety, right? Um, it's kind of the base level infrastructure that you need to have a sustainable society.
Right.
Um, so when that happened, I went to go work for the Department of Energy. At the time, it was during the Rick Perry administration, or I should say the Trump administration under Secretary Rick Perry. They were doing some work sort of in the grid recovery of Puerto Rico. Um, but I really wanted to sort of focus a lot more on Puerto Rico and not some of the other verticals within the DOE.
Hmm.
So I went to go work for the Clinton Foundation under President Clinton. Um, I joined the Islands Energy Program, which is specifically focused on not only rebuilding the Puerto Rican grid and deploying renewable energy, but also addressing energy poverty in other small island developing states. Um, which are very often sort of the most energy poor regions in the world. And this is because often you don't have your own domestic energy resources. You're kind of cut off. You have to import a lot of sort of fuel, which ends up costing a lot of money. So, just as an example, with Puerto Rico at the time, they were paying about 3 times the average American, what the average American would pay for electricity,
Wow.
and their incomes were roughly half. So, do the math. They were paying an insane amount of, for electricity. The grid was unreliable, um, and this was largely due in part because most of their power came from imported fossil fuels. They'd have to bring in. At the time, this was mostly diesel. Now it's nat gas. A lot of nat gas has taken over that. Um, but that just was incredibly expensive. Imagine like there's supply chain disruption. Suddenly, you're without electricity.
Yeah.
Um, and this was despite the fact that Puerto Rico is very sunny. It's very windy. There's a lot of renewable energy potential. Um, and at the time, Puerto Rico had not one of the lowest, but the lowest renewable penetration of any U.S. state or territory.
Mhm.
Um, which doesn't make sense if you think about it. Like, why would there be more renewable energy in Vermont, where it's not terribly sunny
Right, right.
or wet compared to Puerto Rico? Um, and one of the big challenges then was, and this was before I kind of understood Bitcoin mining, was you didn't have a reliable off taker of electricity, right? You didn't have a a flexible source of demand that could complement a renewable energy source that would then make it economically viable to provide that power to communities in Puerto Rico and other small island developing states. Um, so, I continued in the kind of energy climate space, jumped around. I did some graduate, I went to graduate school in China as a Schwarzman scholar. Did a lot more research on the international clean energy transition. That's when I started to learn about Bitcoin, blockchain. Um, yeah, and then I was brought on to SBP. It's been a wild ride ever since, and yeah, it's a really exciting space and having a lot of positive impact.
And I love hearing this blending of, your past passion and then obviously how are we gonna integrate Bitcoin into the future? Because you're right, we don't connect the dots and we think, "Oh, energy's bad, it's using too much." It's like the more energy we have on planet Earth, the better for the human experience, And so obviously doctors don't want to operate by candlelight. That's not the best way to do, practice a surgery. It's not the best way to store your medicine. It's not the best way to store food. So obviously the better quality energy and consistent energy that people have all over the world, the more likelihood they're going to have opportunities to stay healthy and have an opportunity to transact across borders. If you're in the middle of nowhere and you have no internet and no electricity, how are you going to ever participate in a global economy? You're going to be in this micro world. And so can you talk a little bit about, you were saying about who can take up the excess energy. And I think a lot of people don't understand how power grids work. And I'm one of them. I know this much because I'm a Bitcoiner, but I'm not like you who studies this. So can you help people understand why it's important that, you don't get to just turn the grid off because it's hot out and people don't need, something. So yeah, that would be great if people could get an idea of what that means.
Yeah, of course. And the grid is often referred to as the most complicated machine that humanity has ever created. And in a way, it
Oh, wow.
is. You have this network of wires and generation assets and batteries, and it's really this really complicated system. Maintaining the grid is immensely important, right? Like we need it to sort of have electricity. Um, but actually creating a grid, running it, making sure it's resilient, it's reliable. Um, there's all these sort of behind the scenes things going on, right? When you flip on your light switch, you might not think about it, but all this whole value chain of activities has to happen to make sure that when you flip that switch, electrons are running through. Um, and as you mentioned, right, you can't just if you're producing too much electricity or too little electricity, it's not like the grid can just function. Um, you essentially have to match at all times supply and demand on the grid. So, with some sources of energy, they are what's called base load, which means that you can sort of ramp them up and down. You can control how much is being generated. And those are the sources that we've used historically, right? So that's fossil resources like gas and coal, and renewable sources like hydro to a certain extent and nuclear, um, which have their own sort of variability issues, meaning you can't really ramp them up and down, but they're reliable in the sense that they have consistent flow for the most part. Um, but as we want to create more and more renewable energy, which is important because, you know, having access to electricity is critical, but at the same time, we also, want to reduce emissions. We want to make sure that we prevent global warming and basically just create more abundant and renewable sources of electricity. Um, we also recognize that this creates some grid challenges. So with solar, wind, certain other sort of variable sources of renewable energy, what ends up happening is we can't control exactly when they're generated, right? We can't
Mhm.
control the supply, and we also have kind of variable demand throughout the day, right? At night, you might be using less electricity. You might be using more electricity in the evening when you get home. You might be using sort of less at home in the middle of the day. Um, but you essentially can't control. You can't match up that supply and demand.
Mhm.
Um, you end up with what's called stranded energy, which basically means that the generation of energy is trapped in either space or time. Space meaning it's produced in the wrong place. So you have abundant, Texas is a great example of this. You have a ton of wind and solar energy in West Texas. Texas is now the largest producer of renewable energy in the United States. And then you also have electricity. You have also have energy that's trapped in time, meaning it's produced not when you want it, but perhaps at another time. So solar, is pretty consistent, right? You produce solar at the peak in the middle of the day, and then in the morning and evening you kind of produce less, obviously because the sun's not shining. Um, so how can you address that stranded energy issue? There are plenty of existing solutions like batteries. You can kind of send power to certain places, if it's stranded. Um, but there's all sorts of inefficiencies that don't make that optimal. What's
Mhm.
incredible about Bitcoin or Bitcoin mining is it's the first ever load that has a couple of really important characteristics for the energy transition. It's completely flexible, meaning I can make a Bitcoin mining facility that has a gigawatt of capacity, ramp all the way up to a gigawatt, all the way down to zero. I could do this in seconds. It's basically like it's the most flexible load you'll ever find. It's interruptible, meaning I can turn off a Bitcoin mining facility, whereas, say, a factory or some other load, I can't just turn it off, right? Something bad happens. For the most part, if I turn off a Bitcoin mining facility, all that's happening is I'm just not mining Bitcoin, right? Somebody else in the world, whether they're mining at home or in another facility, is going to sort of mine those blocks. Um, it's also location agnostic, which is really important because it can basically go anywhere in the world as long as you have internet connection and access to power. You can mine Bitcoin from anywhere. I know somebody who's mining Bitcoin at the bottom of the ocean. I know somebody who's trying to mine Bitcoin from space. Um, Literally anywhere in the world, right? And then a fourth component, which is also really important, especially as we think about energy poverty and how Bitcoin mining as a load might compete with other loads, is that it's very price sensitive. So Bitcoin mining is not going to be able to pay for the same amount of for the same price of electricity as other buyers of power, whether it be AI or homes or just buy other buyers on the grid. And this is really important to mention when we get into sort of a common criticism of Bitcoin that even if Bitcoin uses renewable energy, people say, oh, that renewable energy would have been bought by somebody else. That may be true in some cases, but for the most part, at least today, or I should say, for the most part, at least as we see moving forward, Bitcoin miners are going to increasingly use less and less competitive power. Um, so that's kind of the supply and demand challenge on the grid.
I think it's important, again, people, I know they think it's like "Oh, if it's being used here, then it's completely taken away from somewhere else, and then this is bad." And so are you familiar, you're probably, uh, what they're doing with gridless? over in Africa. Like, that's amazing, right? And so, an example for those of you guys who don't know, um, they're going into very remote locations that have natural resources that can get converted into power. And it's too far away from any metro city where you're going to say, cool, we're going to hook this up and then go get all these power lines and supply some power to the city. So it's not fundable. These types of projects are completely not fundable in the old traditional sense. And so if Bitcoiners can come in, like Gridless is doing, and say, hey, we're going to put these Bitcoin miners in, we're going to have power generation, you guys get the power, we get some power too. It's a huge, huge win-win. And so the location agnostic component of this is super important for people to get. I mean, we've got obviously Elon and the satellites, and we can do internet anywhere. And so this is something that I think I would love for people to start to really get, like, wow, how are there all these natural resources all over the world, whether it's hydro, whether it's volcanic, geothermal? How can we help, get power to these remote villages so that people can start getting out of that energy poverty? And so, do you have any other examples like that you can share of what you guys are aware of and working on?
Yeah, I mean, there's countless examples, and actually, that's that kind of gridless model where you use Bitcoin mining as an anchor tenant, right, to electrify communities. That was kind of
Hmm.
the first idea that I had when I first learned about Bitcoin mining, right?
Well,
I was at a conference and somebody had showed me on their phone how they moved the load of their mining machines. Um, it went from like a 40 megawatt facility to zero and then back up again in like seconds.
wow.
And immediately, it clicked. I was like, this could bring the hundreds of millions, almost a billion people around the world who don't have access to reliable electricity. This could help bring those people sort of into the energy abundant and give them access to electricity, and not just any electricity, but clean and reliable electricity, right?
Exactly.
Um, and when I was working on Puerto Rico and some of the small island developing states, it struck me that the places in the world that have the highest rates of energy poverty, meaning they have the lowest access to electricity, are these
Hmm.
communities that you just described, right? They tend to be global south. They tend to be outside the city, sort of, not grid connected, last mile communities that are typically rural. A majority of these are found in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South America, South and Southeast Asia, and even even in North America, even in Europe and Asia. Like, energy poverty is pervasive everywhere, but I would say in the global South, it's sort of the most prevalent. Um, and yeah, essentially forgetting everything you know about Bitcoin as a permissionless monetary network that does all these really important things. Um, just from a pure power perspective, it essentially functions as a value battery, right? It arbitrates the power of electricity. I'm sorry, the value of electricity produced at any point in space and time. So what Gridless is doing, as you mentioned, is they're basically going out to these rural communities and essentially being a buyer, right? That buyer of first and last resort. So they could be the anchor tenant. They can then help build out the transmission distribution for some kind of baseload renewable asset, whether it be run of river hydro or solar or wind or geothermal, biogas, whatever, um, and then connect that community and give them access to electricity.
Yeah.
Um, I would say at present, right now we work with about 20% of global hash rate. A significant majority of that is large industrial, institutional, and publicly traded Bitcoin miners. So you have like the Clean Sparks and the Bitdeers and just sort of the Crusoes. Um, they obviously have a significant portion of global hash rate. This model that we're talking about with the small scale miners to help connect these communities. We do have a few mining partners that do this. One of our mining partners, they're actually operating out of Virunga National Park, which is the oldest national park in the African continent.
Hmm.
They take run of river hydro, which otherwise would be stranded, and essentially they can help monetize that and connect communities to the grid, and also actually fund conservation activities in the park. So there's all sorts of really cool, like, Bitcoin mining is effectively a commodities business, the same way that gold or silver, right? You're like mining this precious metal, except for with Bitcoin, you're taking this other uh, resource, which is just electricity or generation of electricity, and you're monetizing it into this exportable, you know, asset. So this also has massive implications for sustainable development because now instead of all these countries coming in, exploiting local resources, bringing them back to build out, whether it's computers or energy infrastructure, or what have you, um, if you could build all of this domestically in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, you now have this massively valuable um, export export commodity class
Yeah.
that can then help fund other forms of sustainable development, whether it be healthcare or transportation or anything.
And you were talking, before we hit go live, that you were speaking with Maya Parbo from Suriname, the presidential candidate, and you were saying maybe you guys could have some type of a way to help them get a little bit more Bitcoin friendly in the country. Is it okay to talk about
Yeah.
that a little bit?
So it's super early. I mean, I don't know if it's
Yeah.
like private, public. Just I think too early to give anything substantive. But I am talking to communities across South America, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and basically saying, "Hey, here are all these stranded renewable assets. Here are these communities that don't have access to electricity. Bitcoin miners could easily come in. They can deploy infrastructure assets to monetize that electricity, and then build out sort of more energy access across these communities." We're already starting to see that in East Africa, where miners are coming in. This is, for the most part, happening at the large scale. You probably saw Marathon's really exciting announcement in Kenya. There was another
Mhm.
miner that I know is about to have a really exciting announcement in East Africa. Um, Sort of another really exciting uh, sort of renewable energy Bitcoin mining partnership. Um, and just to kind of give a sense of scale, what we're talking about here, when I say the stranded renewable energy in these emerging markets, and I recently presented on this at a Bitmain conference, but there's something like times there's more 3 times more stranded renewable energy in Ethiopia and Kenya, just those two countries. Stranded renewable energy. Not talking about total energy. I'm talking about renewable energy that is untapped, right? That like is stranded. Than the entire global Bitcoin network consumes on an annual basis. So in
Wow.
theory, you could bring the entire Bitcoin mining network, everybody in America, in Asia, in Europe, in South America, bring them all over to Ethiopia and Kenya, in theory, tap into all that stranded renewable power, and you'd still have enough to grow the network about times three. So
And
really,
what's the
there's all
price
this
per kilowatt
fungibility.
hour over there? Like, what is that would
So
it be like you're just
yeah,
sopping it
I
up and
think
getting the excess, or are you paying the stranded fees? Like, how does that work?
so. And this is actually part of the innovation for gridless is that they're taking something that truly has a negative price, right? Like
Cool.
they're not taking up the power that would otherwise go to the community.
Mhm.
They're really in partnership with these local operators and IPPs to then develop these assets. Um, with some countries, and this maybe speaks to some of the challenges of this model, right? Like Bitcoin miners coming into the global south to sop up all of the power. There's a couple of potential challenges and things we should avoid here. Um, I would say the first one is just this kind of colonization 2.0 situation we could find ourselves in.
Mhm.
We don't want Bitcoin miners coming in, gobbling up all of the power, and then sort of not doing this in concert with local communities, right? At the end
Yeah.
of the day, like electricity will always be more valuable to somebody who doesn't have it than to somebody who's running a Bitcoin mining machine. Full stop.
Yeah.
As much as I love Bitcoin, I'd rather have that doctor have access to electricity than, you know, somebody mining in Texas and, you know, uh, sort of mining Bitcoin there. Um, the other challenge is policy. So there's like geopolitics and there's policy. Um, a lot of these emerging markets have very challenging like rate designs. They have very challenging power markets. They're not fully developed. Like in Texas has one of the most sophisticated power markets in the world, right? This whole like demand response market, you can sort of very easily be a large flexible load. Um, some countries, like I believe, and you can check follow up on this. But in Kenya, I believe they have a price floor, so they might have like 8 gigawatts of geothermal energy that's stranded, but
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure they're not allowed to sell it below like 8 cents a kilowatt hour, which for a Bitcoin miner today is just not economical, right?
Yeah.
Um, but again, there is some happy medium in there where maybe you can lower the price because right now you're getting zero, right? Or perhaps even negative, right? You're paying for that energy even though nobody's buying it. It's kind of like what happened in Paraguay, where you had
Yeah.
um, the Taipu Dam, right, selling all of this power to Brazil, um, basically at cost, or just running the power at a loss. Um, and you have all these Bitcoin miners that are now coming in, and they're bringing gigawatts of very consistent demand. It's good for the Paraguayan government, for the Taipu operator, and then they can then use this money to invest in infrastructure and transmission or anything else they want to, right? It could go into healthcare or I don't know, whatever the people of Paraguay or Kenya or any of these countries, whatever they want, they can then use this money to invest locally.
Yeah, I think that's super important. So, yeah, Saz Mining is down there doing, something, Kent? Yeah,
Yeah,
he's
I know.
awesome.
Yeah, I know. Ken,
I
there's
got
a lot of really cool miners. Penguin Group is a very large Bitcoin miner that they're not only working with Ande, which is the national grid operator, but they're also investing in like local initiatives. So they have a
Cool.
big, I think it's called Penguin Academy. Um,
Nice.
they're developing local digitally native workforces. So they're investing
Really?
in like training, yeah, not just for Bitcoin mining too, for all sorts of like AI and you know digital technologies that they're investing in people, right? At the end of the day, like Bitcoin is great. It's a great network. It's an important technology, but if it doesn't serve people,
Yeah.
then what's the point? You know?
I love it. I'd love to hear that because I feel like there's so many amazing, educational programs out there, whether it's Me Premier Bitcoin or BTC Data. And it's like, what do people do after they get excited in any community? It doesn't matter where you are. Yay, I want to support Bitcoin. And it's like, well, some of us aren't cryptographers. We may not be miners. Some of us aren't, hedge fund managers and investors and whatnot. So how can we still keep the system moving forward so people get trained for the next level of how are we going to earn a living and how is AI going to integrate into our workforce so that some people, I've heard someone say like, oh, I don't want AI taking my job. I'm like, AI is not going to take your job. The guy who knows how to
Yeah.
use AI is going to take your job. And so until we
Right.
train ourselves and each other on all of this new technology, it's going to get light years. The gap between the people who understand and don't understand is going to keep getting huger and huger and huger. So I love to hear that people are getting trained in some workforce type activities. This is great. So I got to check these guys out. So fun, fun, fun.
Yeah, you should
Um,
definitely check them out. But just to kind of piggyback off that last point, I think, and this would be my message to our industry, right? The kind of Bitcoin space is Bitcoin is inherently a permissionless technology up to a point. So yeah, it's permissionless in the sense that like it doesn't care who you are, it doesn't care your race, creed,
right.
color, sexual orientation, um, doesn't care where you are, right? Like Bitcoin speaks a certain language, but at the same
Mhm.
time, there's a lot of really great people that advocate for Bitcoin being permissionless monetary technology that anybody in the world can access. But if you really think about it, there are billions of people on planet Earth today. Let's say tomorrow we move to a Bitcoin standard, right? Where every single government, every single person adopted, Bitcoin as the standard store of value means of payment. There are about 2.6 billion people on planet Earth today who don't have reliable access to the internet. Um,
Wow.
yeah, so what do we do about those people, right? I mean, there are a couple of really cool innovations. I know Manchkura is a really incredible company out of I want to say Nigeria, that is creating Bitcoin, essentially Bitcoin payment rails, but like you can do it via text. But
Mhm.
even then, you need access to an electronic device, right? Like, if we really want Bitcoin mass adoption, we have to be thinking about all these various sort of caveats when we think about permissionlessness and inclusivity. So I would encourage sort of all these very pro Bitcoin, Bitcoin enthusiasts, Bitcoiners, to also think about how do we invest in that kind of infrastructure, right? If you care about Bitcoin adoption,
Yeah.
then you should also care about internet access, right? You should care about energy access, right? If you
Yeah.
have a smartphone that you can use to buy and sell Bitcoin, but you can only charge your phone every week, are you playing in the same game as everybody else?
Right. Yeah, that's such a huge point. I remember going to El Salvador for the first time a couple of years ago, and it was, for adopting Bitcoin. And of course, everyone's like, woohoo, Bitcoin, Bitcoin, Bitcoin. And, we're all ready to go be evangelists. And one of the women, she was just like, you've really got to understand who you're dealing with down here. A lot of these people don't have access to the internet. They don't have basic needs met. And so you coming here and hyping up, oh, Bitcoin is like, it's an insult and a slap in their face, because you're not even understanding what their needs are from a base level and that aren't even getting addressed. And so to sit and get all hypey about this wonderful new currency technology of freedom, la la la, you're missing the point. So I think, like you said, we don't want to go in and like have the colonization mindset of, okay, we're going to go extract resources, but you also have to have so much empathy and understanding of where you are. And each case is going to be completely different, each location. And so yeah, you're right. I mean, it really is something for all of us to get a little bit more, um, I think, involved in, because I think it's so easy to see the shiny la la la, and it's great. Like, no, like let's put some of our talent, time, and treasure into these basic systems that need to be in place before we can have Bitcoin adoption. So, who do you see? Do you see any? I don't know if Sustainable Bitcoin Protocol is doing this, or are there any organizations out there that you could suggest for myself and the listeners to say, hey, if you want to start helping with the internet in these remote places or energy, like, where can we go to learn about that?
Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, we do help with this, in that we help create a financial incentive to use clean energy for Bitcoin miners, and
Hmm.
we are seeing a lot more adoption of SBP in the global South. We have mining partners in Africa and South America. Um, we have a lot of mining partners in the U.S. and some in Europe, some in Bhutan and sort of East Asia, Southeast Asia. Um, Yeah, unfortunately, there aren't, like, I would say, too many companies that are focusing on the intersection of these different issues. I would like to point out a few, and again, I love the work we're doing at SVP, and
Hmm.
we're truly driving transparency and decarbonization of the Bitcoin network. We're also, very importantly, driving institutional adoption. So we're basically bringing the next $10 trillion of climate aligned capital into Bitcoin is our goal.
10
Um,
trillion? Did you say trillion with the
Trillion.
T?
So I mean, with the
Whoa.
T, I mean, the amount of capital that's earmarked for climate finance, sustainable finance, I always forget if it's 30 trillion or 50 trillion, um, but it's a lot. It's obviously more
Wow.
than the entire market cap of Bitcoin. So essentially, what we've done is we've created a way for these institutional investors, whether they be asset allocators, whether they be um, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, ETFs. Essentially, we've created a way for them to buy and hold Bitcoin in an auditably sustainable way that's also investing in the sustainability of the network, right? Essentially, we've created a market for proof of sustainable Bitcoin mining, and then that can be added to the holdings of an investor. Um, and for a lot of
Can you help us
institutions,
understand? Can you
yeah,
help us understand, walk us through, like, what's like, if I'm a new person or company, entity, fund that is interested in what you're doing, like, how would I go about getting involved with what Sustainable Bitcoin Protocol does?
sure. So our company, what we've done is we've created an asset specific environmental commodity. So we've created a digital asset that is specifically geared towards Bitcoin called the Sustainable Bitcoin Certificate. Um, it is issued to Bitcoin miners that have proven that they've mined Bitcoin with clean energy. So whether that be solar or wind or nuclear or hydro or waste methane gas, as you can see from this graphic here, the
Mhm.
Bitcoin basically prove that, we believe in proof of work, we believe in transparency, just like Bitcoin. We don't just take people at their word. We want to see the proof of work. So once a Bitcoin miner has done this, we can basically voluntarily, from a bottom-up perspective, collect that data, we verify it, and then for every Bitcoin or SAT that a miner sort of unlocks from the Bitcoin protocol, we
Mhm.
then issue an additional asset. So not touching the Bitcoin network, right? Bitcoin is Bitcoin. All Bitcoin are fully fungible. There's no such thing as a red Bitcoin or a green Bitcoin or a non-green Bitcoin. Like, Bitcoin is Bitcoin. But now they have two assets on their balance sheet, right? They have their Bitcoin that they can do whatever they want with, and they have this additional asset, which is almost like a clean energy derivative of Bitcoin mining, right? It's like a proof. It's the data that proves a Bitcoin was mined sustainably. They can then sell this to, BlackRock or Fidelity or any publicly traded Bitcoin investor that wants to, know the sort of climate risk or price in the climate risk of their investments. They want proof that their holdings are climate positive, um, but also in a way that actually incentivizes further decarbonization of the network. Right? We're not here to say that you can't use any one source of energy. Right? Like, any miner using any source of energy is contributing to the security of the Bitcoin network, which is most important. Um, but investors have a preference for sustainable investments. This is a way to do that from a market-based perspective, doesn't violate the fungibility of Bitcoin, and then brings in the next tens of trillions of capital into Bitcoin, right? That would otherwise go somewhere else. Which I hope.
Okay, and so just to clarify, so basically you're getting a certificate, kind of. Is this similar to like carbon trading markets, or am I way off on that? Like, because you've got obviously this certificate that says, cool, we've got Bitcoin that was mined with, all of this great clean energy. Here's your certificate for X amount of units of, the Bitcoin that you guys had. And then you put that on your balance sheet separately, and then you would trade that with another company so that they could also have that on their balance sheet. Have you seen, like, what's the demand for other companies to go, hey, I want this. I need some Bitcoin on my balance sheet. Now I also need to have this offset with the clean, the SBC certificate, or SBP. Yeah, SBC. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, how does that work?
Yeah. So I guess to the first question, it's not exactly a carbon credit. Um, we actually don't deal at all with carbon markets, and the
Okay.
reason for that is because, and this is actually why Bitcoin also is an energy based asset, right? The reason why Bitcoin uses energy is because it needs a way to tie the physical to the digital world, right? That's why proof of work is so innovative. It's why it's so important. You need some kind of proof of work, which is the sort of the computation and the hashing, um, to show that you've done the effort and therefore deserve to receive Bitcoin.
Mhm.
Um, every single megawatt hour of clean electricity that is produced
Mhm.
everywhere in the world is metered, meaning I know, how much electricity is produced. I can't fake the consumption of electricity. So
Right.
we actually deal in the renewable energy markets, right? Everywhere in the world, every single time a megawatt hour of clean electricity is produced, a contractual instrument called an EAC, or Energy Attribute Certificate, is produced.
Okay.
And in order to be able to say that you're using clean energy, you basically have to own that instrument, right? You have to own the rights to that megawatt hour or kilowatt hour of clean electricity. And you do
Okay.
that through this global market of instruments. So when we verify the usage of clean energy, a miner will have to, show their energy consumption data, and all the data is anonymized, aggregated. That way it's all secure. So miners aren't don't have to worry about sort of information security. Um, so we verify the energy consumption. We verify pool data, so we know actually how much Bitcoin a particular miner is mining, and then we need some kind of proof through these EAC markets that the energy that they used was sustainable. So, as an example, one of our Bitcoin mining partners is a company called Crusoe. They predominantly use waste methane gas to mine Bitcoin, but they also
Mhm.
have some field operations in Texas. When you're mining on the grid in Texas, even though there might be a lot of renewables, you actually don't have a claim to that renewable energy unless you've paid for the rights to the clean energy, right? And this is true everywhere in the world, from Google, Amazon, Meta, every company in the world that wants to claim they're using clean energy, you actually have to pay for clean energy. It's not enough just to say like, hey, here are the the wind farms, and here's the solar panel. So we verify that they have the rights to the clean energy. And then for every Satoshi or Bitcoin that they mine, they essentially receive this certificate. And it's a way for them to monetize their use of clean energy. Because, and this will answer your second question, there's a whole generation of investors, predominantly institutional investors and asset managers, that have their own ESG mandates, or maybe they have SEC requirements, right? You have to have climate disclosures, or even in Europe, and not enough companies are realizing this, but in Europe, you actually, starting next year, will have to disclose the emissions of your investments. And so essentially,
All
this is
of
a
your
way,
investments, like
for
every
public
investment that you have for a public
Yeah,
company.
but
Okay, got it.
for public companies, and this is also true for digital assets. So if you have Bitcoin, and it's impossible to say like if a Bitcoin that was mined today versus a Bitcoin that was mined 10 years ago. It's impossible to kind of say which Bitcoin had which amount of emissions, right? Because all Bitcoin is fungible, right? It would be like saying that the dollar in my pocket is worth more than the dollar in your pocket. It just doesn't work.
Right.
Bitcoin needs to be Bitcoin. Every single Bitcoin has to be fully fungible, whether it was produced with coal or with solar, whether Bitcoin was used. My first time I ever really sort of encountered Bitcoin, I was doing national security work, and people were using Bitcoin to for illicit purposes. So that those Bitcoins that were used for that illicit activity should be worth the same as any other Bitcoin, right? Money
Mhm.
should be fully fungible. It shouldn't be discriminatory. Um, and so, what this does is it creates a way for an investor to basically add this proof of sustainability, this proof of sustainable Bitcoin mining to their holdings without actually tagging or changing any particular Bitcoin as green or non-green.
Mhm.
And in addition to that, because it's a commodity, because the way to produce the SBC, the only way, there's no like tokenomics, there's no pre-mine, like the only way to produce this asset is by proving that you've mined Bitcoin with sustainable energy. Because of that, it's going to necessarily grow in value over time as well, right? Because the cost to produce the SBC is basically going to correlate to how much energy it takes to mine a single Bitcoin, which over time trends upwards. So it's a way to
Right.
invest in sustainable Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin at the same time. Um, and it creates this kind of like virtuous cycle where our goal is that Bitcoin then becomes the most powerful climate positive asset that has ever existed. So it'll actually be
Wow.
responsible for thousands of orders of magnitude, so like something like 10,000 times more clean energy investment than the entire network could have ever consumed. So as we scale, Bitcoin becomes more and more and more climate positive, and then it becomes impossible to, oppose it or, brand it as like a dirty asset or something.
And so to clarify, you guys are issuing these certificates. And so can normal people like me get them if I say I want this? And then how much do they cost? And how do you determine the price? How's the market determine the price? And then obviously, if you're the issuer of the certificates, it's not tokenomics, like you said. Um, where does that money go? That initial money that you're giving, you know, certificate from?
Yeah. So I guess the first question, I'll try to go backwards. Um,
Hmm.
there's no cost if you're a Bitcoin miner and you're using clean energy. There's zero cost to participate in the protocol, right?
Okay.
The only thing that you need in order to receive SBC is that data. You need the proof, right?
Okay.
So just coming to us and saying, or submitting your data to the protocol and saying, oh yeah, we use green energy, it's not enough. You actually need that proof. What's great about Bitcoin as an asset class, and this is the only asset class in existence that can do it, is that it's just energy and code. So if we can determine that the energy used to mine the Bitcoin was green, effectively it's a green mined Bitcoin, right? So that's one piece, right? For miners, it doesn't cost any money. Our goal is once there's depth and liquidity, it'll effectively trade somewhere between 4 to 7% price of Bitcoin. Um,
Okay.
and this speaks to your other question. So we want miners to get an additional 4 to 7% revenue on top of their Bitcoin mining, assuming they're using 100% green energy. And it costs more to use green energy, right? You have to like pay for the rights to the green energy. This is a way for you to monetize and pass on that cost to these ESG investors, or even make a profit, right? Because let's say you're paying an extra dollar per megawatt hour for the green energy, and you're selling this at $3 a megawatt hour, which is roughly what we expect it to trade at. It's kind of our index, it's our benchmark. Then you'll be making $2 additional per megawatt hour, just to sort of like offer a few numbers. Today, let's say it takes about 1,000 megawatt hours to mine a single Bitcoin. And if we say the prevailing price of a high quality EAC, one of those instruments, is
Hmm.
$3, which is the benchmark we take working with Cambridge and sort of other experts. So it's effectively going to sell at $3,000. So today, a Bitcoin miner produces an SBC. The theoretical price of that is $3,000,
Okay.
which is roughly for somewhere in like the 4 to 7% range. However, this is a totally market-based asset. We don't dictate the price to anybody. So if you sell it for more than that or less than that, like all we're doing is we're taking this data that already exists, but there's no like database for it, right? The data exists. Like if a Bitcoin miner is provably using clean energy, there's no layer for the Bitcoin network that actually shows that, which is why
Hmm.
the estimates for how much sustainable energy Bitcoin is using vary so much. Like I've seen some estimates that go as high as 60%, which are actually not quite true. And there's also like an accounting piece to this, which is interesting. But and there's some estimates that say it's as low as 10%. Like the reason why these estimates vary so much is because there is no standard protocol that evaluates all this data and collects it. So the price is going to be totally market driven, right? We expect that it'll function as like this clean energy derivative of Bitcoin mining. So again, it'll trail this like 4 to 7% price of Bitcoin, because as the price of Bitcoin goes up, there's difficulty adjustments, but there's also like more miners entering the network, which means that it costs more energy to mine. Plus, you have halvings over time. And then in terms of where to buy them, I mean, there are miners
Yeah.
today that have been verified. They've received SBC. We've even had several transactions take place where institutional investors have bought SBC from the miners. So we have this like proof of concept where we know there are investors that want to add this proof of sustainability to their Bitcoin holdings. They have sustainability strategies. And certainly for miners, right? Miners are obviously interested because it's free money, right? If a lot of miners are going to have to buy clean energy anyway, because
Hmm.
they, whether it's SEC mandates for disclosure or they just care about climate, they're going to have to buy the clean energy. This is a way just for them to monetize it, right? It's like, why not do it? Yeah, and
So
that's kind
where's the
of
marketplace? So how does a normie like me say, I want to go get an SBC so I can go support this? So is there a
sure.
B2B or a P2P marketplace where people can go, get this so that they can say, yeah, look, I've got, I'm supporting the sustainable production of energy for Bitcoin.
So I'll give you a little kind of look under the hood here. Um,
Thanks.
up until now, you heard it here first. Up until now, these have largely been trading OTC. So
Okay.
one of the big challenges here with creating any commodity market is you actually have to create supply and demand at the same time, right? It's
Hmm.
called the cold start problem in economics, where
Okay.
you have an environmental commodity that you want to be produced from this industry, but they don't want to produce it unless there's buyers. Buyers don't want to buy it unless it's being produced, and you have this kind of chicken and egg problem. So that's what
Hmm.
we've been working on for the last couple of years. I think we're finally at this point where we're starting to see more adoption from investors and miners, which is really exciting. Up until now, most of these trades have been done OTC. It'll be a miner that we say, hey, like, here's an investor. They want to buy some SBC from you. You guys negotiate a price and, go in peace, right? Um, there's a couple of really exciting upcoming liquidity opportunities for the Bitcoin miners that are adopting the protocol. I can't go into details, but there will be a couple of upcoming uh, sort of sales opportunities for the mining partners. And our whole thing is like, we're not taking money from the miners, right? We only generate a profit or revenue once we've achieved sufficient liquidity and depth and supply, such that we can start issuing SBC for the historically mined Bitcoin, which I can get to how we do that in a moment.
Ooh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, and that's where the whole climate positive sort of aspect comes in. But yeah, so there's a couple of upcoming, really excited sort of, there's exchange listings and a couple of like institutional partnerships where, you know, sovereign wealth funds, asset allocators um, will be able to buy SBC and add it to their balance sheet, and that's going to help kickstart the liquidity and depth. Um, and honestly, right now, most of the miners that mine SBC have been hodling. They've been holding their SBC. Again, is SBC going to go parabolic, the way that Bitcoin could? No, it's not designed to do that. It'll again track roughly that energy consumption of the network. So, if the energy consumption of the network goes up 10%, then the price will roughly go up 10%. It's not going to jump, 10x overnight. That's not what it's for. It's a stable sort of stable. Again, it's not a derivative, so I have to be careful when I say that, but it's like a derivative of the network. Um,
Okay.
and then in terms of the historically mined Bitcoin, right, which I mentioned, the way that we make money, and also the way we address the historically mined 19.5 million Bitcoin, because if we were working with our goal is to verify 100% of the network, right? Let's say 100% of all Bitcoin miners, all 20 gigawatts of capacity is on the platform. It's all verified. It's all 100% green energy. It's an amazing story, right? And we'll be the first industry in the history of the world to do that. But at the same time, for our asset class, right, we want miners to be able to monetize this activity. And the only way we're going to have meaningful depth and liquidity is if we can also address the historically mined 19.5 million Bitcoin, most of which were produced with very little electricity. What we do is we use Cambridge and other sources, and we index the average energy consumption of the network on a daily basis. So, I could look, and actually, I think it says on our website, I think that there's actually like a ticker that shows roughly what the average energy consumption is. And you can see like how much energy would actually be required to produce an SBC, right? Let's say today it's 1,000 megawatt hours. That means in order to produce an SBC, and this is what our protocol does, is we would have to go into the renewable energy markets. We have to buy 1,000 megawatt hours of clean energy on behalf of those historically mined Bitcoin. And so, what that does is it help ensures like a stable price, right? Let's say there's way too much demand, and there's like a price spike in the SBC. The protocol can issue new SBC by doing that. And on top of that, because most Bitcoins historically were mined with like kilowatt hours and not 1,000 megawatt hours, we're way overcompensating for the historical energy consumption of the network. And so buying SBC, you're driving this kind of climate positivity of the network. You're making Bitcoin responsible for more renewable energy purchasing than the network in its entirety could have ever consumed. And so as it scales, it becomes more and more climate positive, and then becomes the most sustainable investment you could ever make.
That's so exciting to hear about what you can do from the past, and then obviously thinking about going forward. I think a lot of people don't, again, we're not understanding why we need to have all this energy out there. And um, I want to talk about, so that you keep mentioning AI. And I think this is something that people really are not connecting the dots, right? And so, um, whether you're using Midjourney or ChatGPT or any of these, prompting softwares, and obviously there's a million other, things out there, the amount of energy required at these AI server farms all over the world is insane. And so people are all hyped up about, oh, Bitcoin is boiling the oceans and all the terrible things, and what Greenpeace, the campaign that was going on with Ripple. Um, I haven't heard anybody in the environmental space, other than when I was at Summit at Sea several months ago, talking about the footprint, the environmental footprint and the carbon footprint of the AIs and all the server farms out there. And so can you talk about, if you know, the difference between like how much energy Bitcoin is using and what it's um, compared to all the AI computers out there that we're using so easily, like what, just really quick
Yeah.
before you say that, one of the women, that I had spoken with, I'm like, it would be interesting if because we're clueless as consumers of how much energy that uses. And I love to make little Mid-Journey prompts. But if I had a second prompt that said, every time you push this button, you're emitting this much carbon or you're using this much energy, I might think twice about constantly like remixing it or whatever. And so from a consumer point of view, I'm completely uneducated on how much energy this stuff uses. And I just think, la, 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 it's just no big deal.
Yeah, well, I guess like that actually speaks to another really interesting point about Bitcoin's energy use is that we often ask the wrong question, right? It's not like the first question shouldn't be how much energy does it use. It should be what are we getting out of that energy? Because
Right.
every activity, no matter what you do, has an environmental consequence, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're using a kerosene lamp to do surgeries at a remote clinic in Ghana, for childbirth, right? Like, even though the kerosene lamp is not great for the environment, it's better than nothing. It's better than doing it in the dark, right?
Yeah.
Um, with Bitcoin, right? Like it does use a significant amount of energy. The energy amount is growing, right? Like I don't think we should shy away from that. I know we often play this kind of like, what about these guys? What about this industry? Right? Like these
Mm-hmm.
comparisons aren't helpful. We have to decarbonize every sector, right? We have to do it quickly. I'm in Miami, Florida, where it's getting hotter and hotter every year. We're going to soon have these wet bulb temperatures. Heat is the most deadly aspect of climate change. It kills, I think like tens of thousands of people every month or something like that. That's just climate change related heat. I mean, that's scary stuff. So again, what is the value that we're getting out of Bitcoin, right? The reason why whenever I'm having one of these conversations with one of my friends that works in climate or sustainability, the first question I tend to ask is like, what do you know about Bitcoin's use case, right? What is a Bitcoin actually used for, right? Because if you think Bitcoin has zero value, right, zero value to yourself and to society,
Mm-hmm.
and even a kilowatt used to mine Bitcoin, even if the whole network was only running the same amount of electricity as a light bulb, it wouldn't be worth it to you, right? It's all about this kind of cost benefit. Um, there's actually a lot of folks in the climate space that are concerned with the energy demand of AI. I'd say that grid operators are especially concerned. Just
Mm-hmm.
meeting with like EIA, with meeting with ISOs, power companies, like the usage of AI of these open sort of GPTs. It's so expansive now that companies are tripping over themselves trying to build out new AI data centers, which
Yeah.
are similar but quite different from Bitcoin. Um, they have some similarities, but also some pretty important differences. Um, and I'm actually working on a couple of sort of research papers and articles with a couple of big climate experts, people who are much more prominent than myself, um, obviously, um, about sort of Bitcoin mining versus AI. What do you kind of get out of these different loads? What are the differences? There is some attempts to do research on AI and Bitcoin energy consumption. The biggest challenge to date has just been the data, right? Like, we're both friends with Margot. She's a brilliant researcher, but she has challenges with data. Even the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which is arguably one of the most important energy sort of related organizations in the world, they have some pretty good research, but they're relying on data that's not complete, right? The EIA survey, right? The only reason why the EIA, and for those of you not in the U.S., the reason why the EIA, the Energy Information Administration of the U.S. Department of Energy, they need to be able to advise policymakers on how to move forward. They don't care about what Bitcoin does, what it doesn't do. They see gigawatts of new planned capacity in the interconnection queue in the US, and that terrifies them. They want to know how to move forward, right? Which is a very reasonable question. Um, so there are concerns around AI energy use, but I think it's very easy to understand the value or the use case of AI and Bitcoin. I think, unless the product is in your hands, unless you hold Bitcoin, maybe that's what some of these Bitcoin billionaires and millionaires should do is they should, just stats and set up wallets for some of these skeptics. And that way, kind of moves the game theory along. I don't know.
I love that idea. Let's get Saylor and Michael Dell and all these other people who are going to be. I think that would be an interesting way to help understanding and adoption. I mean, it's like the puppy in the hand thing, right? Like, oh, look, it's my thing. I want to take the puppy home. So now you want to take the Bitcoin home if you're somebody
Yeah.
who's on the fence. Um,
And it works in
I,
the opposite direction too, right? Like if you're, I have friends that I also talk to, and every time they see that MicroStrategy has added another 250 million of Bitcoin to their balance sheet, they're like, it creates this psychological problem where they're like, I could never ever keep up, so it's not worth it for me to participate. So I think a lot of the early adopters, I would hope again that it's not their fault, right? It's not, you can't fault MicroStrategy for a winning strategy.
yeah.
Um, but if they want to encourage more adoption, that would be my advice.
So just to clarify, people say they can't keep up, like they think like, oh, MicroStrategy is already so far ahead, why bother? Or Bitcoin,
Yeah, or it's
is
like,
already so
so
expensive, why bother? I'm not going to get a return, or is that the mindset?
yeah, so there is the unit bias piece which is, if you talk to somebody, they're like, oh, I can't afford a $70,000 Bitcoin, like that's,
Right, right,
and then you kind of have to explain it's divisible by 100
right.
million, and that's I think partly education, and actually that's one of the biggest areas where the ETFs have been really helpful. It's like, instead of buying a whole Bitcoin, it's very easier for me to understand I have shares of an ETF, so I can just spend 20, $100, whatever it is, on shares. But what I'm saying is, and this actually relates to, I can't remember the name of the concept, but there's this idea in economics that it's almost like relative deprivation, that you actually quantify your own well-being in the context of others. So they did a study. They asked people, they said to people, you will get a 10% raise at work, but your colleague is going to get a 20% raise. Will you take the raise or will you not take the raise? And an overwhelming, like 90+% of people said they would not take the raise, even though they'd make more money, which sounds crazy, but that's, you can't change human psychology, right? Um, so they, so that's what I'm talking about is when I talk to people, especially individuals, sometimes even organizations, they're like, why should I participate in the system when this one company holds 1% of this digitally scarce asset? Again, you should, like, a philosopher can answer the question of whether or not this is fair and what should you then do. I'm just telling you, like, this is what I've heard from people.
Interesting. I know there's so many obstacles and objections that, depending on who we have conversations with, I don't want to understand it. I don't want to do self custody. It's bad for the environment, la, la, la. Um, there's, there's so many interesting ways for us to keep learning about how do we make sure that, like, these are obviously great, great questions. Do we have the right answers, for people that we're having conversations with? I know before we started the stream, we were talking about just the different ways, like, if I'm talking to this audience, they're going to have this set of, objections and problems that we can support. And if I'm talking to this completely different set of vocabulary, different set of issues. And so I think for all of us as proponents and educators, consultants, entrepreneurs in the space, it's super important to use these two suckers a lot, and and use these two lips less. But it's
Yeah.
always a learning process. It's like I wake up every day and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. Okay, that's new, and I have to keep going down this avenue to learn a little bit more. um, I know we're
Yeah.
kind of coming
And,
on time right now. What
mhm, but
I want to ask you personally, just if you don't mind, um, how has your life transformed since you've entered the Bitcoin space, coming, and blending these two wonderful worlds? Like, how has your worldview changed? How have your relationships changed?
yeah, and I'll just really quickly sort of comment on your previous statement, which I
Okay,
wholeheartedly
sorry.
agree
Yeah,
with. Right, we
yeah,
need to, as somebody who yaps a lot, for work, I
yeah.
certainly need to use my ears more. But I think if we're trying to get adoption of this tool, of this technology, which is agnostic,
Mhm.
right? Like Bitcoin could be
Yeah,
good, it could be bad, it does certain things, it doesn't do certain things, doesn't solve every problem,
right,
contrary to some opinions. But it solves some problems in a very big way, right?
right.
Um, my sort of operating mindset is trying to find out what problems the person in front of me is facing,
Yeah,
especially in the context of Bitcoin, is like, does Bitcoin actually solve your problems, right? Like, what are the obstacles? Instead of just saying, hey, this is something that you should use and have at it.
right.
Um,
Blah.
because for some people, like in the U.S., Bitcoin is mostly used as savings, right?
Right.
Um, if you talk to a lot of communities, like I do a good bit of work in East and West Africa, you know, most of these communities don't have, or most of the communities I work with don't have savings, right? Like they can't afford to move their lives into Bitcoin. Like the volatility, which may be going down over time, but like it's life and death for them, right? Whether or
Yeah,
not the eggs are going to be worth $2 versus $3 one day to the next, like they can't afford to take that risk. They don't have savings. Um, which is why I also get confused. Like I'm a huge fan of Tether. I think they're an incredible company. They're solving a lot of these like energy, internet, infrastructure problems that we talked about. Um, and like people think that USDT and Tether stablecoin is like evil, but the reason why it's been so successful is because there are millions of people around the world who need it, right? And it actually maybe for now serves a better it provides more value than Bitcoin even, right? Like
mhm,
Bitcoin does some things that other technologies can't. Other technologies, there are things that they can't do that Bitcoin can do, right? So I think we should view it as a technology. It's not some sort of spirit, right? Like Bitcoin, as
yeah,
powerful as it is, at the end of the day, it's a technology. How do we use it for good, and how do we prevent any pitfalls? Every technology has downsides too. How do we also prevent those challenges? Um, in terms of how Bitcoin has impacted my life, I mean, certainly as somebody who's worked in the climate space for a long time, like I definitely have a lot of sort of incredulous, looks, and people often ask me, like, Elliot, why are you working? Like, have you decided to kind of move to the other
they're
side,
like,
like working in the climate? Yeah. No, I don't think anybody's cut me out of their lives because I work in Bitcoin. Um, and honestly, I almost don't really see myself as working in Bitcoin. Like I work in climate, and what I'm doing is I'm helping Bitcoin become climate tech, right? I'm helping the world see it as climate tech, and I'm actually helping to unlock Bitcoin's ability to drive the energy transition and support a sustainable world. Um, yeah, but I do get a lot of like weird questions from family, as most folks in our space do. Like, my grandmother said to me recently, she was like, I was telling somebody about this Bitcoin thing that you invented, and how it's going so well. And I had to explain that maybe I am Satoshi Nakamoto. I'm not, but that would be a pretty wild thing to announce on the podcast. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It's definitely impacted my life, and certainly in the work that I want to do. Like, this energy, internet, money, these systems that truly run the world. I think Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining could be an incredibly critical piece of that puzzle and unlocking that future where energy access, internet access, financial access is available to everybody.
And I agree. When, we had talked a while back about Greenfin that just happened in New York recently. Like, where do you see, and obviously we were trying to get on the stages and talk about Bitcoin and everything there, and they were like, no. Why is there such a pushback with the green finance community? Like, how do we get ourselves at the table so that we can all ask questions and learn about what's going on and um, really go a lot deeper? Obviously, this is your
Yeah.
area of genius.
Well, I don't know about that, but I mean, SBP and we really do operate behind the scenes. I mean, the conversations we've had and the fact that we've moved the needle so far with all number of financial institutions that otherwise wouldn't care or be interested in Bitcoin.
Mhm.
We tend to kind of care a lot more about getting things done than sort of talking about it on Twitter or sort of on social media.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's the best way to get these different groups on board, right? Like adoption is going to come that way and not through shaming or through
Yeah, no shaming.
uh,
Yeah, it's not about shaming. It's like, how do we
like
go have dinner
calling
at the
in.
table? Yeah, like, how do we go
Yeah,
and really have deep conversations,
yeah.
because it's super
How
important.
do
I mean,
yeah. How do we care about what they care about, right? Or how do we understand
yeah.
what they care about? You know, um, and actually, we just got invited. SBP just got invited to apply to Verge 24. So
Nice.
Verge, which is also run by GreenBiz, is the largest
Yeah.
climate tech event in the world. They want us to apply as one of their like climate startups to follow. So we'll
Yeah.
probably send in an application. Hopefully, the
Yeah,
Bitcoin
dude.
community can get behind us so that we can really like. Our goal is to show that Bitcoin is climate tech.
Yeah.
So if we make it to that list, if we're on stage telling every single climate tech company, every climate investor in the world about Bitcoin and why it could be this important climate solution, that's how we get adoption, right?
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. So you said Verge 24
Verge
or
24,
25?
yeah. Which
When is it? When is Verge 24?
oh, I'm sorry. It might be 25. I have to check, but
Either way,
it's
that's
either
incredible that
October or March. But yeah, we'll apply, and hopefully folks in the community will get behind it and help us with the message that Bitcoin can be climate tech, right?
totally.
Yeah.
And oh my gosh, that's great news. I'm so glad because that, like, once you're in the door at Verge, then you can go to the Greenfin and the Green Biz and they'll get all that stuff because they're all under the same. Oh, I hope that happens. Yay.
Yeah, and
Oh,
we've like we, again we tried not to like we very much operate behind the scenes, but we, for example, brought the first ever delegation of Bitcoin mining companies to COP28 last year in Dubai, right? It was the first time
cool.
ever that Bitcoin was present at the world's most important climate change conference, the most important meeting on climate change, right? And the goal is like not to come in and tell people, hey, you're dumb, you don't know what you're talking about. We're
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
really good. It's to say, hey, like, ask us questions. Because for one, there's plenty of problems that the climate community is facing that Bitcoin could possibly help. And conversely, there's a lot of issues that Bitcoin and the Bitcoin mining industry might encounter when it comes to climate that this existing body of knowledge and work could actually help avoid, right? So the energy transparency piece is a great example, right? A lot of Bitcoin miners don't understand like what it means to buy clean energy in a way that sort of is aligned with best practices. Maybe there's other industries that can take lessons from. um, so yeah, I want it to be more collaborative.
Yeah, me too. I think cross-pollinating and having lots and lots of opportunities to converse and ultimately be super curious, about each other and not defensive and not I'm right, you're wrong. It's like, no, here's this thing called the earth that we want to protect so we can have a planet for our children and the children's children. And here's the money supply. Hopefully, that will be a positive solution. Here's also ways that we can do this with energy. I think it's super duper important. So I'm excited that you're doing this, and I'm just so glad to know you. And this is such a great journey, and we're just getting started. Um, That's kind of
Yeah,
how I
the
feel.
best is yet to come for sure.
It is. Are you gonna be in Nashville?
I'll be in Nashville.
Good, me
We'll be there
too.
in force. 75% of our team will be there, which sounds really amazing, but we actually only have 4 people. So,
Well,
um,
that's good.
it'll be great. We'll be doing interviews for some of our friends and partners in the space. So would love to sort of interview you if that's of
Sure.
interest.
I'll be there. I'm
We'll
gonna be there. I'm D Yeah, when are you guys do you have a booth or anything set up? Or you said like, tell me how we're gonna
no
people can find
no
you there.
booth. Um, so I'll be speaking at BitMine, which is going to be the sort of institutional Bitcoin pre Bitcoin conference event for
Okay.
those that are there. So find me there, and then I'll be around at Bitcoin Nashville, mostly meeting with our mining partners, talking to some of our potential institutional investors. I'm trying to bring some of my like climate NGO and policymaker colleagues to the event as well. Um, you
Excellent.
know, the Bitcoin magazine team is sort of very supportive of that kind of engagement. Um,
Wonderful.
Trying to convince like friends from the White House and from I think I actually just wrote an op-ed about this, but I think we're sort of almost at this point where it'll be impossible to separate Bitcoin from politics, which I'm quite worried about.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe that's your next podcast. You bring some really smart policy folks in, but I
Oy.
think we're the same way that, and having worked in the climate community, I could say this, but like the same way that we made climate almost like a progressive issue, even though it's something that everybody cares about or most people care
Mhm.
about. Um, I think we're almost at this point where I think the other side of the aisle um, will make Bitcoin a partisan issue, and that you won't be able to support Bitcoin if you're a progressive. Um, that actually concerns me a lot. I think that's a lot more. I think that's a greater existential threat to Bitcoin than any of the climate energy FUD.
Just to clarify, you're saying you think that because one party, obviously we're having Trump and Kennedy that are gonna be at, Bitcoin conference, you're saying if they are obviously promoting Bitcoin, which they are, you're thinking progressives and the Democrats are gonna be like, "Oh, we have to go oppositional just because these guys like it?" Like, that's like
I, unfo-
shooting yourself in the
I
foot.
unfortunately I I agree. I unfortunately think, and there's nothing that, and I've worked for both Republicans, Democrats. I worked for President Trump at the DOE, and I worked for President Clinton. Like I've worked in
Uh-huh.
both Republican and Democratic politics. Um, in my experience, there's nothing that one party likes to do more than co-opt an issue from the other party, right?
Okay.
Especially if they can get ahead on like a very popular issue. So I've spoken to Republican policymakers who care deeply about climate change. They care deeply about the environment, but they know that if they sort of support those kinds of issues, um, they lose elections. Right? It becomes not politically viable because somebody can move to their right, um, or they get tagged from the other side. Right? And I think that's what we're starting to see. Right? If it, Again, I don't think it has to happen that way.
Yeah.
Everybody should care about sensible policy. I think if Republican lawmakers, which have historically been more supportive of the industry, again, there's plenty of Democratic lawmakers that also are supportive, like Congressman Nickel, Congressman Torres. Both of them used to be all of my representatives have been quite pro crypto. So Senator Gillibrand, Wiley Nickel, uh, Richie Torres, um, Maria Salazar. I don't think it's because of me, but I think it's just a happy coincidence. Um, there are Democratic Congresspeople that are or legislators that are supportive, but if you if the Republicans come at it in a way where they say like we're going to end the Democrats' attack on the industry, right? Like the Democrats are against you and we're for you. I think then Democrats will have no choice but to then be oppositional.
Right.
Um, like Senator Warren doesn't care one way or the other about the industry, but she knows it's a political issue for her, right? Um, but if they say, hey, like, we and also the Democrats don't want to follow, right? Like Republicans and Democrats, they don't want to like follow the other party onto a policy platform. So I don't blame them because you can't fault them for a winning strategy. But anyway, it's my worry.
I know you would think like in certain common sense issues, right? Like that everybody could get united on, whether it's taking care of kids, whether it's protecting children, whether it's protecting the earth, whether it's common sense, financial instruments. It's such a bummer, when people have to have that tribal us versus them
Exactly.
mindset. And that's where I feel the consciousness of Bitcoin, obviously it's not this end all be all thing, but this is why I call this podcast Bitcoin for Peace, because I really do believe it's a unifier. It's like money is something that touches us all. So is water, so is air, so is the earth. And so for any of us to drop into a lower um, level of thinking and consciousness around any of those issues, it's like we don't have to be here. We can literally rise up and be unified as humanity, And I think it's super important that we keep pushing that narrative and that possibility because we're being spoon fed toxic, tribalism everywhere we go. And it's all fear based, and it's all I have to be a defensive voter or I have to do this just because I don't want that guy and la la la, instead of truly
Yeah.
voting or making decisions based on numbers, math, facts, analytics, data, yada yada. I think our job as creative evangelists and activists and entrepreneurs is to really keep remembering like this is the new future that we want to build. And it doesn't have to keep looking like this old way, like Bucky Fuller talks about that, And so that's really, really positive and important, I think, for all of us in our conversation. So hopefully that's going to be how we keep moving forward with Bitcoin and hopefully in Nashville too. So,
Amen.
um,
Yeah. Retweet.
amen. Yeah. um, so I will definitely, I want to definitely see you in Nashville. I think I get in on Wednesday and I'll be gone on Sunday, but I'll be DJing at the closing party. So that's going to be a fun little, fun event. I'm excited for that. And yeah, and we'll be speaking, I think I'm doing a panel on Saturday for value for musicians. So that'll be kind of fun to talk about. But where can everybody find you who's listening and not watching? Where's the best place for everybody to find Elliot David?
Um, I mean, I try to be active on like LinkedIn and Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so find me there. I would say if you're gonna like sort of an unsolicited DM, I would say connect with me on LinkedIn is probably the easiest.
Okay.
You could also find me on Twitter. If there are folks that are interested in working with SBP, they can kind of email me. At Nashville, I'll be around. So, we're solidifying our schedule of meetings right now. But yeah, Bitcoin doesn't start or stop with the conferences. It's kind of a
Right.
24/7 thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, folks should reach out if they want to learn more. And yeah,
And say, hey, for sure. And so, yeah, make sure you guys
say
go
hey.
follow Elliot on
So
Twitter
in the
or X.
I'm
um,
sorry,
this,
I keep cutting you off there, but if you follow our social media accounts too, like LinkedIn and Twitter, like they're pretty active and they kind of post regularly about the industry, about the space,
cool.
a lot of educational content. So certainly follow us there. It's more interesting than what I post anyway.
I'm sure they're both amazing. And yeah, so I'll have all the links in the show notes for everybody here, but make sure you guys go check out on X Sustainable BTC or sustainablebtc.org. And you can follow Elliot on Twitter at Elliot_J_David. So thank you again so much. I know our time went up a little bit more, but we could talk about this obviously for hours and hours and hours. And that's what we love to do is talk about our missions and how things are going to make the world a better place. Any final thoughts or words for the audience right now then who might be on the
Um,
fence about Bitcoin as, boiling the oceans and how can they understand the truth versus the fiction?
yeah, I will say, um, especially for folks that are kind of skeptical or maybe even anti-Bitcoin, or think that we sound like a bunch of crazy people. Um, I haven't seen that show Ted Lasso, but there's this one scene from the show that I really like where he says, be curious, not judgmental. So that would be my advice: is like be curious, not judgmental. Like learn a little
Yeah.
bit. If you then decide, that it's not for you, or if that you don't care, like maybe you do have financial inclusion, you don't care about Bitcoin, then power to you. But you know, be curious. I think it's true for people too, but like about
Yeah.
Bitcoin, be curious.
I love that you're ending on this. One of my, uh this is something my sweetie talks to me about. So yeah, it's great. And we both love Ted Lasso. So yay.
I'll have to watch. I'll have to
Well,
actually watch the show. I think I hopefully I'm not misquoting.
no, it's perfect. It's definitely it's great. So yes, it's perfect. Um, well, I love that, and I can't wait to see you in Nashville, and everybody else who's tuned in. Yeah, let's go have some fun in Nashville. This is going to be a very interesting conference for sure. And thanks again for tuning in to Bitcoin for Peace. And I'm DJ Val, and thank you guys for all the work that you're doing out there in the world, Elliot. And make sure you guys go to
Thank you.
sustainablebtc.org and follow what they're up to. So until next time, everyone, peace, love, and warm aloha.